It was a bright, cold day in July 2021, and Durban, Johannesburg, and Pretoria have all gone up in flames. Widespread rioting, mass looting, and political turmoil plunged South Africa into nationwide anarchy, which saw thousands dead, countless businesses destroyed, and the greatest escalation of racial violence in the country since the Apartheid era.
But it wasn't always like this. In the mid-1990s, under Nelson Mandela, South Africans were captivated by the promise of a free and democratic society. 30 years later, however, it seems as though those dreams of liberty and equality have become but fruitless aspirations in a divided, poverty-stricken society that makes Mandela turn in his grave. One cannot help but wonder, how did it go so wrong, and what is there to do about it?
Indeed, the riots were no isolated incident. They were the culmination of decades of political instability, crippling inequality, rampant corruption, and deep-seated historical prejudices. It encapsulates the desperate cries of a nation crushed beneath the weight of its turbulent past. And ultimately, it reveals a much bigger story about how collective insecurity fuels a cycle of oppression that has haunted South Africa from the very moment of its conception. This is the story of insecurity in the Rainbow Nation.
On the great continent of Africa, the southernmost country is the Union of South Africa.
There are two major race groups, white and non-white,
which South Africa's white minority brutally crushed the human rights and aspirations of the black majority.
We are going forward to a united South Africa that we have struggled and died for.
South Africa is a huge country, and among one of the most diverse in the world. From the Zulu and the Xhosa to the Afrikaners and the English South Africans, the country boasts some of the greatest ethno-linguistic diversity in all of Africa. Perhaps the biggest thing that all South Africans, regardless of race, have in common with one another is their shared existence within a system that perpetuates a sense of collective insecurity. Collective insecurity is defined as a state of fear or anxiety stemming from a lack of protection, and in the South African context, it fuels an unending cycle of crippling oppression and insufficient reform that has underpinned every chapter of its history since the earliest conquests by the native Bantu peoples. The first Europeans to arrive in South Africa were the Dutch, who established a victualling station for the Dutch East India Company at the Cape of Good Hope. The descendants of these first Dutch settlers came to be known as the Boers, who speak a derivative form of Dutch known as Afrikaans. With the arrival of Great Britain and the subsequent incorporation of the Cape Colony into the British Empire, however, the first seeds of collective insecurity were irrevocably sown. The Boers, wishing to escape British rule, began a mass migration into the African interior known as the Great Trek, establishing the colonies of the Transvaal, the Orange Free State, and the Natalia Republic. The subsequent flaring of tensions culminated in the Anglo-Boer Wars, which ended with the annexation of the Boer republics into the Union of South Africa. Under the imperial administration, the Afrikaners were demeaned by their British superiors, who largely treated them as boorish second-class citizens, only a step up from the native Africans. Many fled their devastated homes in the Transvaal and Free State to start new lives in South Africa's principal cities, but their unfamiliarity with urban life, their relative poverty, and their often non-existent grasp of the English language naturally excluded them from many important opportunities guaranteed to Anglophone South Africans. The Boers found themselves unable to integrate into broader South African society. Feelings of alienation, uncertainty, and mistrust eventually gave way to growing anti-British sentiment and, more importantly, a sense of collective insecurity. It was only a matter of time before the winds of change would sweep across South Africa. The year is 1931, and the alluring rays of nationalism are shining down upon the British Empire. Britain's dominions, who had so valiantly defended the empire in the First World War, began to demand the right to self-governance. Mounting political pressure in London culminated in the Statute of Westminster, which granted the dominions political and legal autonomy within the British Empire.
With this, the reform had finally come to South Africa. Unfortunately, however, the cycle of collective insecurity was about to rear its ugly head once again. This was the time for far more devastating effects. With the election of the National Party in 1948, the new Afrikaner nationalist government imposed a system of legally institutionalized racial segregation known as Apartheid. The system categorized the South African populations into whites, coloreds, and blacks. The minority Anglo and Afrikaner white populations effectively dominated the entire political and economic climate of South Africa. Like the Afrikaners under the British, blacks and coloreds in South Africa were ostracized, demeaned, and oppressed by the white minority population. Faced with almost daily racial discrimination, constant uncertainty about their futures, rampant social prejudices, and a biased legal system that further perpetuated the racial hierarchy, they too grappled with their own sense of collective insecurity. One that took on far more violence and deliberative manifestations than the Boers had ever had to face. The apartheid system was not without resistance. However, political organizations like the African National Congress led the efforts towards the dismantling of the apartheid system by whatever means necessary. Under Nelson Mandela, the ANC began bilateral talks in 1993 with the government of President Frederick Willem de Klerk. Mandela understood this effort secretly and at a great personal risk. But his efforts were eventually successful. Then, following a 1992 referendum, the government began dismantling the apartheid system in the lead up to the country's first democratic elections in 1994, which saw Nelson Mandela elected as the first black president of the Republic of South Africa.
During Mandela's brief tenure as president, it seemed as though South Africa had finally broken the cycle of collective insecurity that had thus far haunted every aspect of its history. Mandela's unifying forgive and forget attitude allowed all South Africans to unite behind him. Indeed, one must commend Mandela's ability to dismantle the apartheid system and bring about a bloodless revolution entirely through non-violent and democratic means. This is in part due to Mandela's ability to see the good in others, his insistence on a process of reconciliation in place of retribution, and his recognition of both white and black as equal constituents in a free South Africa. On a continent so wrought by racial violence, political instability, and deep-seated inequality, his inclination towards forgiveness was essentially unheard of. Unlike other African leaders of the time, such as Robert Mugabe in neighboring Zimbabwe, Mandela understood that Afrikaners, though descended from Europeans, no longer had a homeland outside Africa. He recognized that there were, indeed, many similarities between Afrikaners and native Africans, for both had suffered through feelings of collective insecurity, social alienation, and systematic oppression. As a result, both peoples had a chip on their shoulders, and he used this mutual struggle as a force to unite rather than to divide. He was conscious of being merciful to the Afrikaners despite the horrors of apartheid, just as he was sympathetic towards the plight of black Africans. Unfortunately, however, it seems as though Mandela's successors were unable to continue his efforts. The election of President Jacob Zuma in 2009 was arguably the final nail in the coffin of Mandela's dream. Zuma's presidency saw South Africa soaring to become the murder capital of the world, with crime and spontaneous violence becoming mere facts of everyday life. Racial violence in particular skyrocketed to near apartheid levels as brutal black-on-white farm attacks became commonplace. All this would culminate in 2021's Zuma riots, where unemployment, violence, and economic ruin would see South Africans slipping back into that ever-debilitative cycle of collective insecurity. But all this begs the question, could it all have been avoided?
Sports, for a very long time, has had a powerful way of removing social, economic, and even political barriers between people. Nelson Mandela saw what incredible powers sports had on bringing individuals together and made rugby a focal point in South Africa. This was to lessen the divide of black and white people, fostering a shared national pride. Rugby, for a long time, was seen as a sport that was only for white people. People back then believed that individuals of color were unable to perform at a high level in rugby. Rugby was invented in England in 1823, which is predominantly a white place, and when rugby was brought to South Africa in 1862, only white South Africans were allowed to participate in that match. It wasn't until 1981 when Aurole Tobias was the first player of color to play on the national team. His journey wasn't easy. He was mocked and disrespected by coaches and decision makers who could not get over the color of his skin, even though he was an amazing rugby player. Aurole played from 1981 to 1984. He started in 6 matches, he had 22 points, 1 try, 3 conversions, and he won all 6 of those games. He carved the path for a younger generation of rugby players. Kids will look up to athletes, no matter their race. If they see someone that's really good, they will aspire to be like them. They will try to mimic their game. And that's exactly what Mandela wanted. He wanted to show that we aren't actually that different, and that if we come together, we are stronger than we were apart. And for South Africa's national team, it worked. They've won many World Cups in the last 2 decades, and recently in 2019, half of their team was of color, like star player Sia Kalusi, who was an absolutely dominant flanker during the Rugby World Cup that year. South Africa should continue to do what Nelson Mandela wanted. He wanted rugby to show people that both white and black individuals can work together to do something great, which they've been able to do, but it's about taking it to the next level and continuing to strive for a country of equality. A great example of this is the NFL in the last 2 years. It's been about showing awareness through putting slogans like "Inspire Change," "Stop Hate," "It Takes All of Us" on helmets and even the field. It's something small, but it gets people just to think about what's going on around them. It's about continuing to get better, and right now, South Africa and many places across the world still have massive problems with equality, and sports, just like Mandela wanted, could be a good outlet to spread awareness and help people who need it.
Oh, the green and white don't fly no more in Salisbury, and the PM doesn't drive a modest car, and they've changed the name, now it's called Harare, and the strangers drinking in the Flagstaff bar, and the trash is piling up on all the pavements, and you can't get milk and sugar, tea or bread. The country's broke and hospitals are crowded, so if you get sick, you'll have to share a bed.